A few months ago, while announcing the existence of Tetris Forever, Nintendo revealed that their Nintendo Entertainment System version of Tetris will be coming to the Nintendo Switch Online service later this year. Many assumed that this would coincide with last month's release of the Tetris compilation, but that didn't happen. We instead got Donkey Kong Land, and then Donkey Kong Land 2. The good news is that the wait is almost over, because Nintendo will finally get around to re-releasing their version of the game on December 12th. Yeah, that's cool news. But is this game actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Game Zone, Nintendo Magazine System, Aktueller Software Markt, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when Tetris was first released. I sure hope you're ready to match some horizontal lines, because now is the time for another puzzling episode of Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew.
When things start changing right before your eyes. When shapes just seem to appear out of nowhere. When the whole world seems transformed. You've been Tetrisized. Nintendo introduces Tetris. It will mesmerize you. Tetris challenges the mind and puzzles the imagination. No other game can stack up to Tetris. Nintendo, now you're playing with power.
Although Tetris had been around for a number of years, 1989 was the year when it finally broke into the mainstream. Not only did Tengen release their version in May, but the influential puzzler became a massive hit just 3 months later when it was bundled with the Game Boy. So when Nintendo went to release the game on the Nintendo Entertainment System in November of that year, there was already ample evidence that everybody loved Tetris. This console port was a no-brainer. Now, Tetris on the NES was more or less the same version that Game Boy owners had been playing for months, only now in color with a few additions to the display. Other changes included the ending and the lack of a competitive two-player mode that had been in the 2 previous versions released that year. In a year when Nintendo was mostly focused on the Game Boy, Tetris ended up being the big holiday release for the 4-year-old console. And now, 35 years later, it's finally on the Nintendo Switch Online. So, when it comes to the reviews, there just aren't that many. Most of the magazines that were reviewing games back in 1989 chose to review the Game Boy version, completely ignoring the NES port. I don't know, perhaps it was a choice to not be redundant since the 2 versions are largely the same. Or perhaps they were just too busy with their brand new 16-bit systems like the Genesis and the TurboGrafx-16. Either way, prepare to be a little bit disappointed there aren't more and better reviews for this iconic NES game. To give you a taste of what I'm talking about, let's kick things off with Game Zone, who gave Tetris the lowest score of any of the English language magazines. Now, it's worth noting that while the reviews worked on a traditional 5-star system, there actually was a score higher than a 5 out of 5 that they called the Mega Zone, which was reserved for games that were better than perfect. Yeah, it's dumb, just like this review. If you don't know what this one's like, then you should be reading Practical Fish Keeping. The Game Boy Classic makes an appearance on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Ugh, Game Zone is the worst. Look, I mentioned English language magazines because there are actually a number of publications throughout Europe that weighed in on this version of Tetris. For example, German magazine Aktueller Software Markt, or ASM if you're into the whole brevity thing, gave the puzzle game an 8.2 out of 12 and complained about the price and the graphics. French magazine Player One gave it a slightly higher 72%, though they did share ASM's criticism about the color scheme. Back in Germany, Video Games Magazine went all the way up to an 88%, while Power of Play went one tick higher with an 89%. And that brings us to Nintendo Magazine System, which gave the NES version of Tetris the highest score of any of the English language publications. Giving it a 91%, they concluded that this block-based mind teaser is the greatest puzzle game ever written. It looks naff, sounds naff, but play it and you'll be instantly hooked. Look, Tetris may indeed be the greatest puzzle game ever written, but this version averaged a less than stellar 78%. That's down quite a bit from the Game Boy version that most of the magazines chose to review, which earned a strong 91%. To be fair, had magazines like Nintendo Power, Computer and Video Games, and even Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewed this version, they likely would have actually raised the average. But alas, we go in with the reviews that we have, not the reviews we wish were written. No matter what, this is a great addition to the Nintendo Switch Online, and a game that probably should have been included in the Tetris Forever compilation. You really can't go wrong with Tetris.
You need a Tetris shop.
Tetris.
Have you been Tetrisized?
Square, rectangle, trapezoid, tetrazoid. Nintendo introduces Tetris. Put a piece here, put a piece there. Use your thumbs, use your eyes. Find yourself Tetrisized. Now you're playing with power.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every time classic games get added to modern consoles. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if we returned later this week with another Review Crew episode because Nintendo announces Donkey Kong Land 3. There's like an 80% chance that happens because remember, this version of Tetris won't be out until next week. Now, here's the question I have for you. Are you disappointed that Nintendo didn't announce more Tetris games? I mean, look, I know that the Game Boy game is already there, but what about Tetris DX or even Tetrisphere? There really are a bunch of Tetris games from Nintendo that aren't in the Tetris Forever package, and this was their opportunity. Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with reviews of recent games, I promise. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,